the producer of this event and instigator, James Snyder, who will say a few words about the man who probably does not need an introduction, but hey, let's follow a schedule and formula that we always do. So here is James Snyder. Thank you very much.
Okay. I'd like to welcome tonight Mark Schubin. For those of you who don't know it, he is the engineer in charge of the Metropolitan Opera in New York. Every time I go to a Met and HD broadcast, I always get a kick to see his name go past in the credits. Mark is an Emmy-award-winning SMPTE fellow and claims to have walked past every exhibit at the NAB Show since 1973. And if you looked at our webpage before you registered, you saw his feat to prove it. And he has evidence of this by his blisters. He will be bringing us tonight his observations from NAB 2023 on 3D, 4K, 5G, artificial intelligence, ATSC 3.0, HDR, HFR, IP, OTA. We could have alphabet soup tonight, couldn't we? SDI, SIM, VP, and lots of other letters and numbers, and even about film and paper. As always, no questions are off limits, although some of the answers may be rather interesting to me. So, Mark, welcome and take it away.
Hey, Mark, 1 second, just some logistics for the room. I'm gonna, because all the crunching, everything, the speakers, mics pick it all up. I'm gonna mute the mic in the room so we don't drive the people on Zoom crazy. If you have a question in the room, just yell out loud. I have a question and I will unmute the room. Just yell it out to me. And if you guys have a problem or something, put in the chat and I'll pick it up here.
And for those of us in the room, could we get Mark up forward?
Yeah, when he starts presenting, he'll come up.
Okay, great. Yep. All right, Mark, take it away.
Okay.
So this was the 100th anniversary of the first NAB show, and it was the 50th anniversary of my first NAB. So I thought I would talk a little bit about that. Because it was the 100th anniversary, they gave out special ribbons that you see over here on the right. And the largest number that they had was 25 plus years. So they gave me 2 25 plus years ones for my 51st NAB. And here's some other pictures. This is the blisters that you heard about. This is with Miss Universe in 2008 and so on. So my first NAB was in 1973. And there were these magazines that people got, BME and Broadcast Engineering and the like, and people wore jackets and ties at the event. As usual, besides the jackets and ties, it was held in Washington at 3 hotels because the year after a presidential election, they wanted to meet the new administration. The largest exhibitors were people like Ampex and RCA, who don't exist anymore. And Sony had a little teeny tiny exhibit where they showed some U-matic equipment. All the cameras used imaging tubes, and therefore color cameras needed registration, and there's a registration chart. Camera cable weighed about 1 pound a foot. Video was recorded on tape. The highest quality was called broadcast. Broadcast, of course, dominated. It was the National Association of Broadcasters. News in the field was shot largely on film. There was lots of equipment for transferring film, and there were some innovations. The BBC talked about their CFAX teletext system. IVC had a 12-hour cart machine. EchoScience had a backpack VTR that weighed only 38 pounds. Asaka had an 11-pound color camera with an 11-pound backpack. Philips had a PCP-90 LLL, that's for low light level, with image intensifiers. Schneider had a 30-to-1 zoom lens, which was an astounding range at the time, and Canon went beyond that with a dual zoom. ComSat introduced digital transmission. CVS, not the drugstore, but Consolidated Video Systems, had a digital TBC. And so BME very presciently said someday the analog signal may disappear. And in fact, it has. But this was at the 2023 NAB show, and some publications were saying, oh, they were there because this was the 100th anniversary. No, they've been there for 5 or 6 years, showing old cameras from the Museum of Broadcast Technology. And there on the easel is that registration chart that I was talking about. Somebody came by and said, what's that registration chart? What do you do with it? And so they let him register a camera. NAB had a big, proud announcement that they had a broadcast district at this show. So it was no longer about broadcasting, but there was some broadcasting. And so if you went to the broadcast ghetto, you got to see some broadcast stuff. There was still lots of film transfer equipment at the show. Not only this company, which is from Netherlands, but also ARRI, Blackmagic Design, Digital Film Technology, Filmlight, Laser Graphics, and a new company called Filmic Technologies that was founded by Jim Lindner. Some of you may be familiar with Jim Lindner. He was the founder of SAMA, which made equipment for converting analog tape to digital files. And there's lots of film out there, but there's not lots of film technicians. And so Jim's idea in coming up with this Filmic system was to have something your grandmother could operate. And it's perfectly fine to thread it wrong, put the film in upside down, inside out, whatever. Doesn't matter if you have magnetic or optical sound. And there's multispectral illumination coming, which will maybe help with some scratches and stuff. But you know, extraordinary that if the film is backwards and it's got a magnetic track, how does that work? Well, he actually worked on getting a head that could read the magnetic track through the thickness of the film. So very impressive system and very inexpensive. The crowds were back this year. People were mentioning large booths for Sony and Blackmagic. There were others, including Evertz. But there were more food trucks than outdoor exhibits. And I had a theme that I thought of at this year's NAB, which was hyper reality. And maybe you thought I spelled that a little differently. These were the flags flying outside the convention center. I'm pretty sure the one on the right was meant to be the Mandalorian. And the Mandalorian was the first series that really took advantage of virtual production, or VP. But it did that starting in 2018. So nothing wrong with virtual production, still a hot topic, a lot of people looking at stuff. But this was what was called the Unreal Ride last year at NAB. You got on a motorcycle and they did a virtual production ride for you, and then you got to take the recording home. And so there's all these people lined up to get that. Here is 2023. There's a couple of people waiting, but this was now old hat. And when it came to virtual production, people were more interested in seeing the actual technology. And so this is one of the realities in virtual production. It's a truck, and there's a reason that this is a virtual production truck, and there's a reason that it has those ramps for a vehicle to go up. This goes around the racing circuit in Europe, and they take the race cars and they put them in the truck and do a little virtual production promo for whatever the race is that's going on. So that was available to see on the show floor. SMPTE is very involved in virtual production, and virtual production seems to be moving so fast that SMPTE decided that the standards process might not be fast enough for it. So they came up with this new thing called RIS, or Rapid Industry Solutions. And these are the people who are involved in the rapid industry solutions for virtual production. This is sort of peripheral to virtual production, but it's a company called Zero Density, and I was very impressed with their Traxis camera tracking system. And they can use either a traditional LED wall, as you see over here, or traditional green screen, and there's nothing required for the person being tracked. You don't need any dots, don't need to wear anything special. It just tracks you and adjusts shadows and lighting and so on according to where you are, and you can move around graphics and so on. So very cool system and relatively inexpensive. And this was another one on the periphery of virtual production, a company called Aximmetry. And when you're doing green screen, it's very important to have the lighting be flat and no smudges or anything on the green that might show up. Well, they use a camera or multiple cameras to shoot the green screen and then create a clean plate from that, and then use the virtual clean plate as the green screen rather than having whatever might be smudged in real life. Also very inexpensive. And both of those companies, one of the reasons that they might be inexpensive, Zero Density is based in Turkey and Aximmetry is based in Budapest in Hungary. This was the smallest virtual production system at the show. It's called Skyglass, and they use the sensors that are involved in an iPhone. And I don't mean the image sensors, they use that too, of course, but there are attitude sensors in the iPhone. And so they, like everyone else, use the Unreal Engine and so on, but they can move the iPhone around, and the Unreal Engine, the virtual production stuff can happen based on those attitude and position sensors on the iPhone. Now, they do charge a fee for this, and there's a monthly fee, and this is the huge fee that they charge. You can start at $4.99 a month and get all the way up to $24.99 a month for their maximum system. This was NAB's theme this year, Welcome to What's Next. And one of the things that I saw based on that idea of what's next is this big exit sign. This is a very, very big exit sign. You can't really appreciate from the picture how big this is, but if that were my bed, not only would I be comfortable, but all of my friends could join me in it and we probably wouldn't touch each other. So huge exit sign. And why do I say this is a what's next? Because the exit sign was over a solid cinder block wall. So perhaps what's next will be an exit. This is why we have trust issues, like non-stick fry pans that you can't get the label off. Speaking of non-stick, one of the features at NAB this year, and it seemed to be just this year, was the booth label adhesive wasn't as strong as it used to be. And so people were walking around with booth labels on the soles of their feet, and people looking for booth numbers sometimes had a hard time finding them. This was another sign that was at the West Hall, perhaps sign of things to come. But gender was a very good thing, I thought, this year at NAB. This is on the left, the TV News Check Women in Technology Awards, and notice all the men in the room. This is a good place to find talent that you might want to hire. And then on the right, no scantily clad women on the camera sets anymore. And a lot of people had musicians, which was good because they could just jam all day and not have to look like they're sitting there being bored. But we still had spokes magicians, so that was a good thing for the show, a tradition carried on. Now, NAB announced the winners of the 2023 Product of the Year Award. And why does it say winners when it's the product of the year? Well, they have so many categories and so many possibilities that there were 150 products that were awarded, and there's only 1,208 exhibitors. So you had about a 1 in 8 chance maybe of getting an award. And it wasn't just NAB. TV Technology gave out 59 winners of the best in show. And the same publishers, other publications gave out awards, and other media gave out awards. And the IABM, the International Association of Broadcast Equipment Manufacturers, gave out their independent awards. And at least those awards went typically to companies that you might not have heard of before. And disclosure, I'm a judge on the IABM awards. And NAB had a new category of awards. They gave out awards for excellence in sustainability. And that was 9 awards plus 6 honorable mentions. But why do we go to NAB when you travel, you are having a terrible carbon footprint? There were 65,000 people, more than 65,000 people, which was up about 20% over last year, and 17,446 from outside the US. So they had to travel a long way. So we can do production and post remotely and in the cloud, but we need to gather in Las Vegas to learn about software. So I thought this was interesting. Chris Chinnock is a reporter and editor who typically comes to NAB. He's with Insight Media and Display Daily. And he said this was the first time in many years that he did not come to NAB, but that didn't stop him from writing 3 articles about the highlights of the show. I might do the same thing next year. Maybe we do need to be there because the website is not necessarily so great. I was looking for something in the central hall, so I clicked and it immediately said central hall. And then I had to wait and wait and wait and wait. And I'm not going to keep you here as long as I waited until I decided nothing was going to happen. And so I just picked up the print edition of the show guide and very quickly found what I was looking for. So paper was still significant this year, so significant that this exhibitor, Transperfect Media, was giving out notebooks, and people were grabbing them. They thought it was a really hot thing to have. And the show had a lot of reality that was just a little bit of an improvement or something like that. So Telestream previously had Lightspeed live capture. You may be familiar with that. It allows you to start editing what's coming in immediately. Don't have to wait for a file to be completed or anything. At this year's show, they introduced a software-only version of it. There was some low-level hype. Here's a company that had cameras, and they said, any speed, any resolution, any cable length. Okay, you know, we can forgive them. They meant any typical speed, like 30i or 60p, any typical resolution like HD, any typical cable length. But, you know, it won't work if I say I need 1 million miles of cable and 10 trillion frames per second and a few billion pixels per line. Here's Prime Focus Technologies using a lot of AI and doing some great stuff, but you know, announcing they can automatically convert horizontal videos into square and vertical formats. Here's a frame from the movie The War of the Roses in 1989. And what is the AI going to do with that? I mean, even a human is going to have a very hard time deciding what to do with that. Do we show the middle of the frame, which is just empty chairs? Do we show one person at the side or the other person? Do we just shrink it to the point where we can't really make anything out? So not so easy. And then this company was there, MuxWave, with what they called a holographic LED screen. Now, very impressive. It's a transparent LED screen, and they had it in their booth, and it was cool, but there is absolutely nothing holographic about it. And here's a story from Deadline. Now, I'm taking some liberties with this, and I'll tell you in a moment, but when people talk about ATSC 3.0 having two-way interactivity, that's just plain wrong. And the liberty that I was taking was I deleted this last line, which said, working in tandem with broadband. But if we're working in tandem with broadband, why exactly do we need ATSC 3.0? Now, this was a system that was available in the late 1980s for doing interactivity with broadcast television, and they could do interactivity based on overlaid text or selected audio, or even if you were on a cable system, you could select different video from different channels. And here was interactivity using a return channel that was a separate transmission system, but in this case, for this Zenith phone vision broadcast in 1951, the return channel was a telephone line, and the telephone line had much less bandwidth than the TV signal. But the proposed ATSC3 return channels are internet-based, and so here is a speed test result from my T-Mobile 5G modem, and at this time, I've got 242 megabits of download and 70 megabits of upload. If the ATSC channel gives me even 10 megabits, which would be a huge chunk of its capacity, am I going to notice that when I'm getting 242 megabits? Probably not. So this was an exhibitor called Vincit, and I say, Vincit, Omnia, Veritas, truth conquers all. And 5G will only get better, but there are some problems with 5G. So these charts on the left, which are from earlier this year, January of this year, they seem to show T-Mobile doing very well compared to its competitors. But in terms of availability, even T-Mobile just available 49.7% of the time. So Teradek is saying, hey, if you want to do mission critical stuff, you need to bond all of the carriers, don't just do one. Well, how do you do that? They say use our SIM card. So Teradek is now in the carrier business, and they're offering Teradek data, and they can use multiple carriers and worldwide coverage, and can be configured for anything. So I thought that was kind of interesting. This I also thought was interesting. Coexistence of ATSC 3.0 and 5G. MBMS is multimedia broadcast and multicast service in a single RF channel. So that's nice. But these are the people who won the NAB Innovation and Technology Award. And I have nothing bad to say about their system. It's terrific. It uses ATSC3 to do a data dump to first responders. It's a great system. It's well engineered. There's wonderful results. The first responders get all the information they need, but there is absolutely no reason that they had to use ATSC3 for it. It was okay to use ATSC3, but they didn't have to. And how do I know that? Because this was transmitted over broadcast radio in 1948, and it didn't even take up the whole radio channel. It was just a subcarrier, so you could still have music playing while the New York Times facsimile edition was being transmitted 4 times a day. So here's the ATSC booth, and a lot of people listed there as working with ATSC. And there we see the communications director in her ATSC dress, and a lot of people in the booth. And my first thought was that all of those people in the booth and all of those companies put together are probably more than the number of people who are actually viewing ATSC3 signals at home at the moment. And yet it is the most sustainable TV delivery system. And they're not talking about that. Instead, they're talking about interactivity or accessibility or other things that are not unique to ATSC3. And as for that sustainability, well, you know, the rest of the world is not sitting idle. So here is a consortium that's working on getting more energy efficiency to 5G. And yet, broadcast is still doing pretty well. The number of antenna owners is increasing, and it's increasing particularly among young people. And if we look at the results of the Super Bowl this year, the Fox Super Bowl had 113 million viewers, making it the 3rd most watched TV program ever. The first 2 were also Super Bowls. But look down at the bottom, and this is talking about the streaming, and there were many, many streams that were carrying the Super Bowl, and a total average of about 7 million people. And they say that's an 18% jump from last year. Well, compare that to the 113 million viewers that they had. So a lot of people were not getting the Super Bowl via streaming. So here's a story about ATSC 3 in 2023, and this publication says, fair warning, this story looks just like the one from last year, or maybe even the year before. And yet it is a superb broadcast television transmission system, and that's what they should be pushing. So a bipartisan group of senators are now saying, hey, we got to do something to get ATSC 3 going. And so at the show, the head of the FCC said, yes, we're going to have a public-private partnership and we're going to get it going. What is going to happen? We don't know yet. So another form of transmission that people talk about a lot is the cloud. It's as though we're sending everything to some specific thing up in the sky. Well, it turns out the cloud is really basically somebody else's computer, but it doesn't have to be somebody else's computer. It could be your computer. So if you've got a bunch of computers and say a bunch of edit suites, and they're not doing things 100% of the time or not using all of their capacity all the time, these people have stuff to give you a little private cloud, and you can do your own cloud work with their equipment. So I thought that was kind of cool. The Atomos Shogun Studio 2, this is here mostly because last year, Atomos went from the Shogun 7, which could record 4 different HD signals simultaneously, to the Shogun Connect, which was connected to the cloud and yet could only record or deal with 1 HD signal. But now with the Studio 2, they have 2 monitors that are HDR, and they can record 8 signals simultaneously, and they also have an 8-second cache. So you can just be sitting there not recording, and somebody say, oh my God, what just happened? That's when you can hit the record button, and you've got everything from 8 seconds before you hit it. This was the smallest booth at NAB, a company called Yellow Umbrella. They're based in the UK, and they're actually a pretty significant player in language services, things like subtitles and so on. And they have artificial intelligence services built into their system. But let's look at artificial intelligence. There was lots of it at NAB. And some of it was what I called no problem. So Atelier had what they call deep analysis and frame DNA, which looks at your storage and gets rid of anything that's duplicated. And they say that maybe they can save you as much as 90% of your storage by doing that. And MediaKind Atlas was using AI for encoding and upscaling. By the way, the Super Bowl was upscaled to 4K. It was shot in HD. Aquila had an artificial intelligence system for sustainability to reduce the energy. VizRT had one for keying. All of that is what I say, absolutely no problem. Then I have a category called maybe supervised, like Adobe Premiere Pro will do AI transcripts and text-based editing, but maybe it misses something. So you want to have somebody do a little proofing on that. Or EVS extra motion does in-betweening, so you can shoot at a low frame rate and yet go for super slow motion stuff, and it'll fill in all the frames in between. Or Mobius Lab superhuman vision for tagging. Again, maybe it misses something. Not big deal, but something you want to keep an eye on. But then I have this section of caution, and I'm not going to talk about ethics because I am no expert in that area, but I do have some familiarity with errors and infringement. So one of the things at the show was Kiki. Kiki is an artificial person who is a sign language interpreter. And that's really cool, except maybe if she starts interpreting some really bad language instead of what it's supposed to be. And Veritone had a generative AI system they were using for talent acquisition. And did they reject the talent because of a hiccup in the AI, or was it because of actual reasons not to have that talent? So let's talk first about that upscaling, the 4K that Fox did for the Super Bowl, and they used artificial intelligence for that. And who knows, maybe they had the world's best 4K upscaler. By the way, thanks to Pete Putman for the term 4K instead of 4K. But down at the bottom, this Consumer Reports article says that if you're going to have 4K streaming, then you need maybe 18 to 25 megabits per second to maintain the picture quality. Here's Samsung, and they're doing AI upscaling in the TV set. And maybe it's just as good as what Fox was doing at the network, or maybe it isn't. That's something that people will have to figure out for themselves. But notice that if you're transmitting HD, you need a quarter of the data as if you're transmitting 4K. And this was in 2019. So since then, many more companies have adopted various versions of AI upscaling. So this was the first NAB at which IMAX appeared. And the reason they appeared was they acquired the company SimWave that looks at streaming. And I recommend that you go to this website, and they have a wonderful white paper. And here's an image of something that hit 48 on their scale of quality. They said overall, the different streams were doing around 73 to 83, but this one's 48. Clearly, it does not look very good. And here are two different streams, different companies. And the one down at the bottom, there's different vertical scales, I should mention also. So the one down at the bottom never really went below 65 or something like that. The one at the top had much more consistent overall quality, but there were a couple of times when it went down low, and one of those seems to be that 48 that we were just looking at, or pretty close to that. Why should we, go back to here. Why should we convert to 4K at the transmitting end if we can convert to 4K at the TV set and not strain the streaming that much? But let's look a little bit more about AI, and this is the another error section in which I flunked the Turing test. I got on ChatGPT, and I was working on a project where I was looking for women who worked in pioneering television engineering research, and I said, can you tell me about some of them? And they, gave me a list of 4, and 3 of them didn't seem to have anything to do with television, which is typical for search results. But then there was this one, Marion Edwards, American engineer who worked in the television industry, key role in developing color, and inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame. So I say, wow, tell me more about engineer Marion Edwards. And so it gives me this amazing, amazing bio. And I'm just drooling at every line here. It's absolutely fantastic. This wonderful person. And then I start researching it, and not a word of it is true. And you'll notice up at the top, it says that was result 1 of 7. So I kept hitting the regenerate button. And each time I did, it would come up with a totally believable resume, except the second time she worked for CBS and she worked on something other than color. And then the third time, maybe she worked for Dumont and she did something completely different. All completely made up. It's stuff they refer to as hallucinations. So I spoke to, by the way, where did they come up with the name Marion Edwards? Well, it turns out there's a couple of people in our industry. Here's somebody who works in animation, and here's somebody who worked in international TV. So that's where it got the name. Where did it get the other stuff? It searches the internet, it gets words, it puts them together, and it sounds extremely believable. So I spoke to someone who is involved in AI, and I told him what happened, and he said, oh, no, you can't use AI for searching. Give it something that you wrote and ask it to summarize it. So I put in my bio, and I said, summarize my bio. And this time, it's like 99% accurate each time I did it. But each time it also said that I was a member of the Broadcasting and Cable Hall of Fame. And I'm not. but I kept hitting regenerate, and it would keep giving a wonderful summary of my bio and always say I was in the Broadcasting and Cable Hall of Fame. So you have to watch out for the errors. Now, in addition to the errors, there's something else. Bard is now incorporating Adobe's Firefly, and of course, Adobe has Firefly. So this was asked to come up with an image of a unicorn, and it comes up with a terrific image of a unicorn, and any kid is going to be very happy with that image of the unicorn. But that image of the unicorn has a mane that has blue and gold and pink colors, and it's got a gold horn, and it's got little blue fetlocks above the pink hoofs. Where did that come from? It came from someplace. It wasn't just made up out of whole cloth. And if it came from someplace, well, here's Getty Images suing Stable Diffusion, which is an AI art generator, for copyright infringement. And how do they know that there's copyright infringement? Well, when Getty shows you a picture before you buy it, it's got this big Getty Images logo. And so when Stable Diffusion was asked to make a picture of soccer players, it finds pictures of soccer players. They tend to be Getty Images. And so it decides, oh, that's something that ought to be in the picture. And so they make a fake Getty logo in there. So very clear where that image came from, and therefore, sorry, did somebody have a question? Nope. Okay. And then here's more recently, the Supreme Court ruled against Andy Warhol in a copyright case. And this has to do with a photograph. Now I'm showing one of the Warhol versions of it over here. This clearly doesn't look like a photograph. He has clearly modified it significantly. And yet the Supreme Court ruled against the estate of Andy Warhol in this case. So if you use generative AI, then you're leaving yourself open for those kinds of things. Here's a song that was done based on stuff from Drake in The Weeknd, and this didn't even involve a lawsuit. Universal Music Group just said, hey, you have to take that down, and everybody did. So if you use generative AI and the source is not something that you have permission for the generative AI to use, are you going to have troubles with that? It's a question. This has nothing to do with AI, but I just thought I'd throw it in the idea of technology not necessarily helping. So as you heard, some of you heard before when we were discussing at the beginning of the meeting, Blackmagic has 2110 gear now, conversion from SDI to 2110 and vice versa, but it's not a lot of it. So all of Blackmagic's 2110 gear is within that little red oval that I put up here, and this is the Blackmagic booth. But here are some new Blackmagic products, and these are SDI switchers that run at 12K, and so you can do 4K at 60p very easily on these. And the bottom one is a 40 by 40 routing switcher for $4,000. If I were building a very large facility, I would want it to be 2110. If I'm building a smaller facility, I would be hard-pressed to justify the cost of the 2110 at this point. There were new 2110 cameras that were introduced at NAB. So there's one from Grass Valley on the left and Ikegami on the right, but both of them also have SDI outputs. And there's other ways of getting things around besides 2110. So now there's Dante AV. And that was all over the show. You could see booths that said they were complying with Dante AV, but there's not even just one Dante AV now. There's Dante AV Ultra, which is their higher end version, and Dante AV H, which is their lower end version. And same thing with NDI. There's a high bandwidth version of NDI and a low bandwidth NDI HX3. This was an interesting thing that Rotolight showed. It's a smart softbox, so it's an electronically controllable diffusion. Not so new. There was actually a truck that I used in the 1980s that had a window between the audio room and the control room that had electronically controlled diffusion in it. This was more exciting to me, which was the electronically variable ND filter in some Sony cameras, but this was previously introduced, so not unique to NAB 2023. A lot of people seem to like using large format cameras like the RE digital cinema cameras for live events like the Super Bowl halftime show anyway. And so they need tally and they need CCUs, or what RE calls CCP, or camera control panel. So RE has this live stuff, but live can be hard. This is on the eve of NAB, and Netflix was doing a Love is Blind live reunion, and everything was fine to the output of the truck, but they couldn't get it to the viewers. And it isn't just Netflix. Here is a little bit later, YouTube showing a repeating Little Mermaid ad instead of the NAB playoff game. And you all probably heard about this yesterday. DeSantis does his big moment on Twitter, and it doesn't happen for quite some time. So Grass Valley says, we love live. Great. People clearly need help. And pat yourselves on the back, those of you who work in live TV. More on the large format stuff. Fujinon had a box lens, but with a PL mount. So this works on the large format cameras. And this lens has a 25 to 1000 millimeter range. So it's about 40 to 1. So it's gotten up to about where we were in 1973 for television cameras. Vertical video was a big thing because people have those iPhones and Androids that they hold vertically. And so here's a vertical format PTZ camera. Also, Blackmagic Design has some new software for their pocket cinema cameras for them shooting vertically. This was an Astro Design camera, 8K at 240 frames per second, which sounds like a very high frame rate, except here is a video game that will run it up to 600 frames per second if you have some way of watching that. So here's me in 1973 with some low light level shooting, and the first camera on the left is a Bosch Firenze KCU-40, which had bias light tubes, and that was a unique thing at the time. There's a CEI 270 with SEC tubes, that's secondary electron conduction tubes, so extremely sensitive. And then new at NAB 1973 was that Philips PCP-90 LLL with image intensifiers in front of each tube. So let's look at image intensifiers. Generation 1, about 1,000 times amplification of the light. Generation 2, 20,000 times amplification, pretty good, but the light that's on in the house is causing a big blur. Generation 3, we have more amplification, but the main thing is that the light in the house isn't that much of a problem. So Canon came up with a new type of sensor. They call it a SPAD. SPAD stands for Single Photon Avalanche Detector. And they say that their CMOS sensor has 1-to-1 multiplication, one photon generating one electron. And the SPAD sensor, one photon can generate 1 million electrons. And so at NAB 23, they showed this camera, the MS500, which uses broadcast lenses before mount. And they say it's able to operate even at 0.007 lux, which is less light than an overcast night with no starlight. So very impressive, very terrific, except that in 2015 at NAB, Canon introduced this camera, which has a CMOS sensor, but a very large CMOS sensor. And they said the minimum subject illumination of that was 0.0005 lux, which is 14 times lower than what the 2023 camera can do. So something to think about. Audio Technica had this immersive mic system on the left, and a New Zealand company called Dotterel had this microphone called Konos with 80 microphone elements. Well, what can you do with 80 microphone elements? Well, here is a drone. First, you'll hear a conventional microphone on it, and then it's actually got a two-way system. So there's a loudspeaker on the drone, and then you'll hear a special mic.
What I was just trying to say might have been a call for help. It might have been critical instructions. It could have even been a threat. Up until now, there's been no way to tell because all UAVs are deaf to what is happening around them. At Dotterel, we've developed aerial audio, the world's first two-way audio communication payload.
So they're saying you can now use drones for interviews. 3D at Sony on the left was a volumetric capture. So a person would stand in there and it's shot by multiple cameras in multiple directions. They had a spatial reality display, which is auto stereo, meaning no glasses. You just look at the display and you see things in 3D. They've had that before, but this one is 27 inches and that's new for them. But that was not the only autostereoscopic display at NAB. Here was a laptop from Asus, and it too does eye tracking and autostereoscopic display. This monitor I was more interested in at Sony. It's the BVM HX3110, and it's an HDR monitor. And they were touting that it's good to 4,000 nits or 4,000 candelas per meter squared. But notice that there's an asterisk up there. And if you look at the asterisk, it says, well, we're not guaranteeing that. And the auto brightness limiter may work. And so, take that with a grain of salt. Here's an issue with HDR. House of the Dragon was on HBO and viewers were outraged. They said it was too dark to see, and HBO defended the images, saying they were an intentional creative decision. Well, yeah, they were an intentional creative decision in a grading room that was dark and had an HDR monitor. And that's not necessarily how people are going to look at stuff. Now, you can do HDR even on an SDR set by dealing properly with converting it. This is something from NAB 2016 ISO video, and they essentially were using a spatial high pass filter. So they're removing the great changes in contrast, but they're preserving all of the local contrast. And with AI, you can make that even better. This was another thing on the Sony monitor, the BVM HX3110. They have fast response, so much faster than what you would expect from an LCD monitor. And there are reasons why you might want to do that, but you buy the monitor and then you pay for a license to get the fast response. Another thing from the Sony monitor, it's got a viewing angle of 89 degrees with a contrast variation possible of 10:1. Absolutely fine for a grading suite, no problem whatsoever. But for a truck where there are multiple video operators who are looking at each other's monitors to see how things are going, that 10:1 contrast ratio is not necessarily a great thing. And it's not just HDR in video that's an issue. There's also a problem in audio. Amazon is adding an AI feature to boost dialogue and make it more intelligible. Well, great, but why was it unintelligible to begin with? You may have seen this notice late last year about Illuvio teaming up with Warner on Lord of the Rings. Now, last year I made fun of NFTs because it's not really a business that we're in. It's like saying, we have a transmitter on this hill. Wouldn't it be great if we had a farmer's market under the transmitter because we have all this space or under the tower? Well, yeah, but you're not in the farmer's market business and you're not in the NFT business either, except with Illuvio, they are making it your business. And so they're doing distribution with what they call content blockchain or content fabric blockchain. And so everything, the NFTs and everything else are all tied into it. So they had a very big presence at NAB this year. And they're saying that they're even more efficient and less costly than using clouds and CDNs for distributing your content. And they've got lots of stuff on their website about what you're giving to the NFT owners and what kind of access they have to different things to see. It's worth checking out if you have any interest in that. And finally, I took away the name of the manufacturer who came up with this ad. Somebody said, oh, the viewfinder's pointing the wrong way. Well, it's not the viewfinder pointing the wrong way. It's just the diopter part of the viewfinder, the lens part. And sometimes people do take that off to look at the viewfinder. So that's not a big deal. But they do have the lens cap on. So not a great way to shoot. Again, a PDF of these slides is available at bit.ly/SDC or SMPTE-NAB23, or just shoot the QR code on the left, and that will take you to the slides. They are available right now. And I'll leave this up for a moment for those of you who want to shoot the QR codes, and then I will stop sharing and we can continue. Thank you all.
Mark, does anybody have any questions for Mark? In person, online?
Online, just unmute yourself.
I had one for you, Mark. Give us a little bit more, if you could, about your impression about the Filmic film scanner. Did you get to see any of the multispectral aspect of it?
Only for talking. He did have a little prototype that he was holding, but he doesn't have that available yet. But he was saying that he thought that by using multispectral illumination, he might be able to get around certain scratches and other defects that might be found.
And you mentioned something about the price point being remarkable.
Yeah.
Can you comment on that?
Well,
Did he give you a number, I guess is my question.
he gave me a number, but I'm not sure that it's a number that I should spread, but it's a price point that's in the 4-figure range. And so it's not Blackmagic Design 295, but it's also not a Centel scanner kind of number, even the Blackmagic Centel scanner.
Thank you. Anybody else have a question for Mark? Online or in the room?
Yeah, Mark, what was your single biggest takeaway on the positive side from NAB this year?
That people are trying to solve problems. So, you know, my hyper reality or hyper reality, there was hype, but there wasn't that much of it. My biggest complaint on the hype was always ATSC 3, because they keep trying to make it out to be something that it isn't. And it's perfectly fine and wonderful for what it is, so there's no need to do that. But I thought there was a lot of problem solving going on. So very impressed with the Dotterel UAV audio, although I can't at the moment think of how I'm going to do an interview by a drone. Very impressed with the zero density Traxis system. I just kept watching their demo over and over again because it's really good, and that's another one that's fairly cheap and is being used by people. So yeah, there's problem solving going on, and I think that that's a good thing.
Any online questions?
Yeah, if you're online, you can just unmute if you have any questions. Anybody on the Zoom?
One of the things I noted was, at least when I was attending the show, a lot of folks were talking about the possibility of AM disappearing from cars. Do you have any thoughts or comments on that?
Well, the car makers have done a reversal. They removed it supposedly because of the rise of EVs, electric cars, electric vehicles, and all of the circuitry in that was going to interfere with the AM reception. But the big makers are now saying, oh, we've gone back and we're going to keep AM, and they're saying they'll do a software upgrade for anyone who bought a car that doesn't have it, and they'll put the AM back in.
And I also saw HD radio. Did you note anything of note about HD radio or not?
I'm sorry?
HD radio?
Yeah, I mean, that's been around for a long time.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else in the room? Carl?
I have a question about ATSC 3.0. I think it's really cool. It makes sense. I'm excited about it. What I don't see, how do you get the end user to be aware of it, excited about it? Because everybody lives in the world of tap, tap, swipe, swipe. How do we move forward with getting end users involved?
Well, Michael Powell's FCC, whether you agree with what he did or don't, he certainly got ATSC 1 out there by having a date that NTSC had to be turned off, having the government pay for ATSC receivers and requiring broadcasters to transmit both. None of that is happening with ATSC 3. So
we don't even have transferable must carry between 1 and 3. So
Yeah.
the cable company, the cable operators have they aren't compelled to carry anything I put on a 3.0 transmit. So you're basically signing up to potentially lose viewers until the FCC does something real.
Yeah. And we need all the set manufacturers to put it in. And if we're going to have accessibility, we need them to put in the accessibility stuff. ATSC 1 had accessibility. It had a dialogue channel, a hearing impaired channel, all was available. And Dolby had a pretty low fee that they wanted for the license for that, but it wasn't low enough for the TV set manufacturers. And so they said, screw that. We're just putting in bare minimum on the audio. And if any manufacturer doesn't go for the full accessibility package, you can't do an accessible transmission because you're going to have viewers who won't be able to access it.
Okay, last call. Anybody else in the room? Anybody online?
Anything in text there? Any questions?
Yeah.
No, it's all good.
All right, well, clearly you overwhelmed them, Mark. Thank you again.
My
A
pleasure.
pleasure as always. So one last round of applause.
Thank you all.